So really what we're doing is we're starting at this point, starting to put some of the HVAC components back together and some of the structural pieces. That's that little metal piece right there, you'll see in some of the videos, goes for the top of the actual steering wheel, and then we'll put the actual dash back in, some additional HVAC components, steering wheel, an instrument gauge cluster, and the clock back in the dash. And then what we'll do is we'll go back and start putting in some of the electrical components around the steering wheel. Those HVAC components can go in at any point in time. The vent covers, radio, upper dash, stick control. This will go in first, followed by the top of the console. We'll put back the blower, and then a whole bunch of additional panels and components that can go in after the fact, after everything's sort of back together. And this is, again, roughly the order that these things will go back together, and then we'll finish up in the engine bay. The very first thing we're going to do, of course, is we're going to build a grating for this that for some reason wasn't in this car. So we're going to build a customized grate that you can, I'll show you how to do. You can get it from the Home Depot store. Some netting to make sure that the mice don't come back into the car again. I'm not sure if there was something supposed to cover this originally, or if there's a piece taken out. The car has never been, seriously serviced or overhauled by anybody other than the dealership. So if there was something there, it vanished. But we're going to build a new screening to keep out the mice, and then we won't have this issue again. So the point of tearing apart the entire dashboard was to get at this item. That's the air handler box. It's right in the center of the dash. In order to get it out, we had to remove the entire dash and all the components in it in order to get the crossbar to actually pull out wide enough so we could get it out. And the point of doing this was because the mice were crawling in the engine bay of the car and then inside the blower motor of the car, and that's where they were storing food and piss and crap and a bunch of other stuff. So where they were getting in was right inside this hole right there, and you can see the hole goes right onto the inside. Now for whatever reason, this Infiniti, or Infiniti itself, just never put any sort of cover on there or screening to actually prevent the mice from getting up there. And once everything is back together again, then there's nothing stopping the mice from crawling inside the blower area. This is where the blower area connects up to the air handling box, and we didn't find any dead mice anywhere in the actual car, but the car reeked of mouse feces and mouse urine. The scent was just permeating throughout the car. There was possibly some dead mice or dead mouse material inside the actual blower motor, but we didn't find any specifically. But what we did do is we pulled out this blower motor, and then we actually cleaned it all out, and one of the stinkiest parts was that styrofoam piece right there that goes in the bottom on the inside here, and that was the one that was really reeking. So we've actually cleaned it all out, we've sanitized it all, we've used disinfectants and deodorizers. So now we're ready to put the whole thing back together. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to take care of this hole so we don't ever get this happening again to us. And what we're going to do in that case is we're going to custom fabricate a mesh that will go over that hole without reducing the amount of airflow into the car. So we don't want to restrict the airflow, but we do want to make it small enough so that the mice cannot crawl in there, and we'll show you how to do that. So here's the old condenser. You can see that it's got some sort of two-sided black foam tape, and you can see there's some of that mouse stuff all embedded through there, and that's why we were getting rid of it and replacing it. We don't want to pick that through. Plus the blower actually blew all the urine and scent into here, so we just decided to get rid of it. It's a good thing to replace anyways. This hasn't been replaced since the car was bought in 2006. So we're just going to replace the whole thing. We're going to go out and see if we can find some of the two-sided foam tape that will suffice for the purposes of sealing this unit. Okay, two things I should mention about this process before you start. And the first one is obviously you should drain the coolant if you're going to replace the heater core, which you should. And secondly, before you take the car apart, you should drive it over to any repair shop or any automotive repair shop and have the air conditioning coolant extracted. You can add it back in yourself, which will show you how to do, but taking the car over is a first step to get the air conditioning coolant taken out and disposed of properly is one of the first things you should do when doing this car. So this whole mice crawling on the inside of vehicles is a common issue nowadays with many imported cars and many domestic cars as well. Has to do with the fact that the automotive companies are not sealing off these openings. It's a standard problem that shows up in a lot of repair shops in town. So if you want to stop this from happening to yourself, go through your car up against the firewall, look for ways the mice can get in, and then seal them up. Okay, so as you can see, this is the fix we have. We have this wire meshing that we're going to actually fix into that hole to stop the mice from getting inside the blower area of the car and setting up their home. As you can see, the holes are rather large. That's not going to stop any mouse. So we're going to overlay on top of it this finer mesh, and we're going to zip strip it. It'll reduce the airflow a little bit, but not enough to be any significance. But what that will do is that will keep the mice from crawling inside the vehicle. And so you can see what I've done here is I've just taken this mesh and I've sort of started cutting it to size. I've clipped it off down at the bottom a little bit. You can see that behind there's a few of the strands behind, a few of the pieces of metal behind, and a few in front to give it sort of a clipping mechanism so it can clip in. And now I'm just going to start trimming it and so I can push the actual framework inside of this plastic housing, as you can see sort of right up here that I did right there. Okay, so there you can see our framework mesh is in. It's pretty solid, and it'll do for the next stage, which is putting the finer mesh over top. Okay, there it is, finished off. Ugly as spit, but pretty solid. I doubt anything's going to crawl through there and shit all over the inside of this car. Okay, so this is our new AC condenser. You can see I've gone and bought some automotive foam tape, and I basically replicated the current one that came out of the car, and we're going to reinstall that back in the blower box. So here is the installed AC condenser, and you can see it on the inside there, and there is the valves that you have to make sure you're aware of where they belong when you put them back in on the actuators, which is down on the bottom there. But one thing you are going to have to install before you do anything else is you're going to have to put in this temperature sensor, and it goes on the inside, towards the inside of the car, and it just sort of jams right into those fins. Make sure you don't do any damage when you're doing it. Just try to slip it between the fins and slide it in, and it'll just sit there and track the temperature of that air conditioning unit. Okay, so there you can see the condenser is reinstalled back in the blower box. It's a bit of a tight fit. Just make sure you don't damage the foam when you're sliding it in. That's why you wrap it around on the back side a little bit, and everything else is set to go. So as you can see, we've now got the heater core in. We've added this component back on. We'll add these two things back in, and most importantly, there's this little white clip that has to go back into the bottom here that holds the core in place. Okay, so this is the HVAC, or the blower box, from inside the G35. And you can see what I've done here is after putting in the heater core, which is down in here, I've attached two side components onto this, and this is one of those actuators that I talked about before. Make sure that if you take out these actuators that you're aware of the position of the internal panels that go up and down, slide up and down, to make sure you put them back in the right spot. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this piece here was put in, this piece here was put in. This covers the heater core piping, and you can see there's how the actual wall mount grommets go in. One thing we had to do on this one was down here I had to put a couple of little bits of JB Weld or some type of glue or an epoxy in here, just 2 little dabs. And the reason for that was because this was popping up and leaving a bit of a gap. It's not that big an issue, but we just wanted to make sure it was sealed down, so we put just 2 little tiny dabs of glue in there and pinched it overnight just to hold it in place. They'll easily pop up if we have to take it off to get out the heater core in another time, but I hope we don't have to do that with this car. Okay, so this is the inside where I put that mesh in the other day. And now what I'm doing is I have taken off some of these little bolts and things that actually hold on the firewall insulation, and I'm pulling it aside, and then I'm going in there and I'm taking this rag, which is covered in a mixture of Lysol and disinfectant and water, and I'm going inside and I'm actually cleaning out all the areas where the mice might have actually got in, or where they might have actually pissed or shit, in the hopes that that gets rid of any of the lingering smell. Then I'll spray it with the disinfectant as well back there, just to make sure that we actually get rid of all the smell. I don't think there was anything back in here because this was pushed up against the firewall, but since I got it apart anyways, I'm just gonna take a rag and clean it up. So here you can see we got the box back in, and this is by far one of the hardest things you're going to have to do on this whole thing, because this bar is going to fight with you unless you disconnect absolutely everything. Also, you got to get lined up with the 2 holes in the back. You got to get these big grommets in place at the right point and get all the other things lined up. It's going to be a bit of a task. Just stick with it, take your time, go slow. It does eventually go in. It sits on 2 large pins at the back. They're plastic pins. They stick out of the firewall and are mounted into the firewall. They don't amount to anything, but they do go into 2 sort of holder slots at the back of the HVAC box here, the air handling box, and they sit right on there. You should feel it sort of clip in and slide in nicely when it's done, and it should just sit there nice and firm. Part of the problem you're going to face is down on the inside here, as you can see, you got to come through sort of one firewall and then through this other sort of frame component that you could take off. I didn't bother to, but you can see there those 2 rather large grommets right down here. They're large rubber grommets that the pipes have to go through, and then these grommets have to go into this sort of framing component here, this sort of light frame piece. And the same on the other side. And it's the same on the other side over here. You're going to have to get that grommet in and the pipe through the grommet without having it all disconnected. So make sure those grommets are in place before you start connecting back up the hoses down there for the heating. One of the pieces that I had to disconnect as sort of one of the last steps was this electrical component box back here. It just has a screw sticking out of the firewall there. And I had to take this out in order to loosen this cross member, this cross bar here, so that it was capable of being wide enough to get the air handling box out. And it's just a simple little 10 mil that's going to go on that screw to hold it in place. Okay, so this is a fuse box that we had to disconnect to get a little more leeway on the actual wiring. You can see that I have put back in the 2 pieces I took out, which were these connector components. These clips sort of slide off this way, and then once you put them back in, you just put them back in and slide those clips back in, and they'll push that connector piece back in. And then this thing just goes back up over top of here and gets bolted in right in there like that. So we'll right in there like that. So that's the piece we're going to put in next. Okay, the next piece we're putting in is this fuse box. We had taken it out before. Goes in with 1 screw on this particular clamp, and then there's also a couple of plug-in components that we had taken out. They just go plugging back in when you slide this thing to the side, which I'm not going to do right now because it's being a little difficult, but you slide this piece over here and then the thing pops out. There's another one in behind, a smaller one. Those pieces are in. We also reattach this plug back in here, which holds the wiring in place. So before we start to remount this roll bar back in, this sort of front mounting bar, this frame piece here. We're going to, I call it a roll bar because it's circular. It's crazy. It doesn't help you in a roll at all. Anyways, we're going to start putting some of the components back in that have to be in place before this thing gets remounted back in. In particular, the two vents for the front passenger and driver side. Those got to be in before you reattach this thing, or you won't get them back in again. Okay, this is going to be one of the harder things you're going to have to do, is to get this roll bar support frame thingy back in. You're going to need a couple of people, one to lift from this end while you put in the driver's side first. And the driver's side has a couple of large bolts that go through it. You can see there's one there and one down in here that go into the, on this side, go into the bar on this side, the support. And then down here there's some more sort of bolts to put on. This one here that comes from the other side. So it's easiest if you have a second person helping you lifting on the one side. I had to get somebody to help me here to be able to lift this one side so that this side could go in first, because you sort of have to lift it and sort of slide it in, and then you can bolt it on. Okay, so we've sort of got the front support frame bar in place. It's roughly in place. As you can see, I still got a screwdriver holding it in there. I'm not going to fully mount it in just yet because we got some other components to start putting back together again, but we can start to sort of get some of the pieces back in. You can see I've re-pushed the actual harness back in place, and I've reattached one of the ground wires, put some loose zip ties to replace the existing zip ties that were on there. They were cracking, they were old, they were sort of decaying. I'm going to put a couple of zip ties on there because they're pretty heavy duty, the ones I took out of there. And then we'll continue on putting components in. Before I get anything gone too far, I'm going to start putting some of the air components back on in the back here. Okay, also way in the back up there, you can see there's one additional bolt that has to be put in as well. So also when you're bolting in the cross beam, cross member there, the roll bar thingy, you'll actually have to put in a couple of these. You'll see these are covering the actual bolts that you see inside the door panel. They just pry off, so just take a screwdriver and gently pry them off and they'll pop right off. And then once you're done, you can put them back on again. We've torqued these things down, as well as the two bolts that had to go on, one on this side and one in the back there, and we're now ready to move on to some other pieces. This defroster handler, how it clips on is there are two little clips right down there. They're pretty hard to see, but they're basically, they just jam in there, they spread out. When you're popping this back off, if you carefully pry this off, it'll just pop right out. Hopefully it won't bust anything. There's one on here and there's one on the other side. The unit just sits there a little bit loose. It'll get a little bit tighter as other pieces go back on there. But that is the piece that you actually need to sort of get in there, and when you're getting it off, it just sort of pries out. I don't know if there's really any way to get a tool in there to actually pry that back out, but it's just sort of a spring load thing that sort of pops open like this as it goes in. When you pull it out, it comes back out. Before you put your this defroster air handler on, there are 1, 2, and then in back of here there's 3, a third right around there. There's 3 little clips that go on, little bolts that hold on the insulation onto the firewall. So make sure you get that on as well before you start putting too much stuff back together. Make sure this little piece is up. It's an electronic component that goes underneath the dash. You'll need to make sure that's in place. Also, this is an antenna component that goes back to your radio, so make sure it's wired around somewhere where you can actually get to it at some point. We'll still feed it through where it should be once we take a look at the old pictures to make sure we've got it in the right spot. And then this item here is going to have to be bolted in. That's one of the next things we're going to do.